one announcement before we begin to introduce Mr. Bob, which is that next month on October 11th, Dr. Ryan Burns will be with us. He's assistant professor of history at Jacksonville State University in Alabama, and he's going to speak to us on the Reformation theaters of conversation in early modern Scotland. And so that'll be terribly interesting, and I hope you'll all join in for that next month. So now, I think it's time to move forward with our presentation today. And we're so very pleased to have my good friend, Robert McLeod, who is president of the Cape Fear Scottish Immigration Memorial Project in North Carolina, with us. And I just want to tell a little story. I first met Bob and his lovely wife, Sandy, during, some of you will remember, during the 2023 Moore County, North Carolina electrical grid blackout, which lasted several days. And it happens, I was in North Carolina, where I incidentally grew up, for the 50th year celebration of the North Carolina St. Andrews Society. They were having a black tie gala. And the McLeods were simply unbelievable in welcoming several of us into their lovely Wilmington area home as refugees. And Donna Priscilla McLeod generously included me in their wee band of refugees, hosted by the awesome Sandy and Bob. So Bob, we all owe you our deepest gratitude, and Sandy for your kind display of Scottish values and hospitality. And Don, I can't thank you and Priscilla enough for taking me under your wing then. But Bob, we're so excited to hear about your project. You've been working on it for several years. And I think we're ready to turn it over to you now. So if everyone will mute your mics and dim your cameras, and I'll help those of you who are having difficulty. But Bob, if you'll get your presentation up on the screen, I'll mute and dim mine after that happens. But welcome, Bob McLeod. Okay, looking good.
Here we go. Let's see from the beginning. Okay, there we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
It's hard to believe that it's been 12 years since I retired and returned to my home in Wilmington, North Carolina, from the many years I've worked in the Chicago area. The one thing I really miss, though, is attending the monthly history forums at the Scottish home and really enjoying those wonderful scones. The Cape Fear Memorial Fund is a 501c3 educational organization. It's our mission to commemorate and celebrate our state's Scottish heritage. Arguably, North Carolina is the most Scottish of all the states. With little movement into the rural areas of the state until after the Second World War, there were pockets of multi-generational Scottish families that were largely untouched for many years. Up until the very early 20th century, there are records and recordings of some of the older Gaelic speakers. But before I get into the work of the Cape Fear Scottish Immigration Memorial Fund and our Scottish Immigration Project, which we call the Scottish Trek, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the state and why it's worth our effort to commemorate these early Scots. First of all, why are there two Carolinas? There's actually many reasons, but the two main ones are demographic and geographic. On this early slide, it shows the break between the two, but geographically, the colony of Carolina reached from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi River. So it was really a very large piece of land. From a demographic perspective, Carolina was granted to 7 Lord Proprietors by the Crown for services to restore King Charles to the throne in 1660. In fact, the word Carolina comes from the Latin Charles. These absentee landlords paid very little attention to the workings of the colony and none of them actually even visited. The southern portion of Carolina was settled largely by wealthy English planters who came there by way of Barbados. They were attracted to the natural harbor at Charleston and the Low Country. This Low Country has vast areas of low-lying land with tidal creeks and rivers. This was ideal for the cultivation of rice, which depends on having both high and low water. As you can see here, the Low Country is a pretty large area, and it's only a few feet above sea level on average, so the creeks and the rivers are all tidal. And Charleston here, the harbor of Charleston, is located pretty much in the middle of it. And Charleston has this beautiful natural harbor, and those of you that are history people will recognize a little fort here called Fort Sumter, which of course is where the Civil War started many years later. So even though the rivers and the rice fields are freshwater, the ocean tides backing up at the mouth of the rivers influence the water height. Rice farming is very labor intensive. Not only was the actual planting and the harvesting of backbreaking work, but a network of canals and ditches had to be dug. The particular rice grown here was called Carolina Gold. It was very much sought after worldwide as really a good rice. Although not to the same extent as South Carolina, there were also small rice plantations along the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, which is also a tidal river. This is an overhead shot of an old rice plantation about a mile from my home on the Cape Fear River. I've cruised up these canals in a small John boat. It's hard to believe that these ditches were dug by hand using enslaved labor between 250 and 300 years ago. These were very small plantations compared to the huge ones in South Carolina. Gates were built and installed so that the water level in the fields could be controlled. The way that would work is if they wanted to flood a field for planting of the rice, they would open the gates at high tide. Water would flow in and fill up the fields, and they would close the gates, and that would retain the water as the tide went down. And the tide, you have two tides every 24 hours, one high and one low. So then the opposite would be done when it was time to harvest the rice. They would open the gates at low tide, let all the water out, and then they could go into the fields and harvest. Just to give you an example of the height, where I am here on the Cape Fear River, probably 35 miles from the ocean, maybe a little more. We have a 4.5 foot tide every day, or twice a day, actually.
Wow.
This type of farming was also practiced in West Africa. So it was that many of the enslaved workers that came here were already skilled in this type of production. As a result of this part of the colony really had two classes. You had the rich European planters and a vast number of enslaved workers. Kind of think of Gone with the Wind, that type of thing. The northern part of the Carolina colony was settled at this time by mostly small farmers that migrated down from Virginia. While there were slaves working in the tobacco and the cotton fields, there were not nearly as many as down in the Low Country. The Charleston elites looked down at these people up north and offered them no help with governance, so these two populations felt little in common with each other. The other reason for the split is geographic. As we have seen, Charleston has a beautiful natural harbor, or as the locals like to say, it's where the Ashley River and the Cooper River come together and form the Atlantic Ocean. If you look north into Virginia, they have the Chesapeake Bay, the James River, Norfolk, another great harbor, and further up, the Potomac River. So it's no wonder that Virginia grew quickly and attracted many of the wealthy English settlers. However, if you look at North Carolina, you have the Outer Banks. They extend from Virginia line all the way down to, well, over halfway down the state. This area, let me map here, yeah, this area from right here in Virginia line all the way down to Beaufort, North Carolina. This is the South Carolina line, so as you can see, it's over half the state. But right offhand, right, geez, be quiet, Kaylee. Right off shore, we have what is known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Now, this slide shows many of the known shipwrecks. As you can see, just a vast number. And this is probably a long way from being a complete list. Before the days of radio communication, ships would leave port and never be heard from again. Ships continued to be lost there into the 20th century. As a matter of fact, in 1942, during World War II, there were over 90 ships sunk by U-boats prior to the convoy system being put into effect. Two of the major rivers in North Carolina, the Pamplico and the Neuse, empty into a sound behind the Outer Banks, making them inaccessible to ocean-going ships. As you can see, your Outer Banks here and the shallow water below. So these rivers that empty into it, you can't reach them. Matter of fact, the water is so shallow in there. I've been out there in a small boat, and you have to be very careful that you don't run aground. The only river that flows directly into the ocean is the Cape Fear down here. Do you want to guess how it got that name? As you can see on Google Earth, even though it is submerged, you can see Frying Pan Shoals that extends about 30 miles out into the Atlantic. Without buoys or navigational markers, it's indeed a very treacherous river to enter. From 1930 to 1965, the end of the shoal was marked by a lightship, then a light tower, and now nothing due to GPS. They don't need those markers. However, the tower is still there, and it's an Airbnb. So if you want to visit, you can get there by helicopter or charter boat. So in about 1712, the split was made. South Carolina basically cast off this troublesome backcountry to be its own royal colony. The second royal governor of North Carolina, appointed in 1734, was Gabriel Johnston. He was a lowland Scot born in South Dean in the Borders region. After the Tuscarora Wars, which killed many white settlers in the state, he was challenged to find a way to populate North Carolina with European settlers to help develop the colony and also to keep the hostile Indians at bay. Being a Scot, he was aware of the economic problems in the Scottish Highlands. After the last Jacobite uprising, the clan system was being dismantled. Sheep grazing was more profitable than collecting rent from poor crofters. As a result, an outbound migration had already begun. Moving south to Glasgow or Edinburgh to work in a factory or a woolen mill was not an attractive option for many reasons. These were people that knew only about agriculture, and as Gaelic speakers, they could hardly speak the English language. They would feel as out of place in those two cities than they would have been any other city in Europe. Wanting to stay together as a familiar group, they started leaving for other Commonwealth colonies where they could hold on to their shared language and culture. Gabriel Johnson recognized this, and he saw an opportunity. This is a pamphlet that was put out in Scotland, marked 1773. Information concerning the province of North Carolina addressed these immigrants from the Highlands and the Western Isles of Scotland by a, quote, impartial hand. And this was the cover of a pamphlet that told about the wonderful opportunities for land ownership and beautiful climate. And basically it was just like a tourist brochure of the day, I guess. He offered these people land for very little money and a 10-year tax abatement to give them time to clear the land and start making a living. He also required them to sign an oath of loyalty to the crown. Since the immediate coastline had been settled, the land he offered was the Sandhills region. Then in and around what is now Scotland County. As you can see, the port of Brunswick Town is here on the Cape Fear River, and the Cape Fear River runs up this way to what is known as the fall line. In other words, where the coastal plain ends and the higher Piedmont begins. That's about 100 miles up the Cape Fear River from the royal port of Brunswick Town, which incidentally is where the royal governor lived next door in Russellborough. So here's Brunswick Town near the mouth of the Cape Fear River, just upstream from a small fort, Fort Johnston, which was to protect the town. This is an artist's rendition of what the town would have looked like in the later 1700s. This building is Russellborough. It's the home of the royal governor. Today, if you go there, it is a ruin. It's covered, it's under roof, but hasn't been really restored at all as it was. This shows one port or one wharf, and actually toward the end they had 3 wharfs, and it was just a small little community. Today you'll see these ruins. They've been excavated since they started in the early 1960s, and they've identified most of them who lived there. Was it a shop? Some of them had a workspace in what would have been the basement, and the people would have lived upstairs. It was just a typical little town of that time. The largest ruin that is still there is the St. Philip's Church. It was completed in 1768 and burned by the British in 1776. And in that graveyard is the grave of the royal governor Dobbs, who died in 1764. The first organized group of Highland Scots to arrive at Brunswick Town was the Argyll colony. They landed there in 1739. Over the following decades, up to 20,000 Highlanders arrived at that port. They signed their loyalty oath to the crown, and then they traveled upriver, either by flat boats or, depending on their finances, actually by walking. So this is your Cape Fear River, and as you can see, the various tributaries. Of course, there were no roads at the time, so that was the means of travel. Initial settlement towns in the Sandhills were Cross Creek and Campbelltown. After the Revolutionary War, the towns had combined, and they were renamed Fayetteville. This was the first of several American cities named after Lafayette. When they arrived at the new homes, and before they could clear the fields for cultivation, the products that they first produced were known as naval stores. This land was heavily forested by the longleaf pine. These trees are rich in sap that can be harvested in a similar manner as maple syrup. This is what is known as a cat's face. They would start by cutting the V and catching the sap, and when that dry up, they would come down below and keep going down, only doing it on one side of the tree so the tree would not die. Once gathered, the sap was distilled into 3 products: pitch, tar, and turpentine. These products were in high demand by the world's largest navy, the British Navy, and also by merchant fleets. The pitch was used to caulk the seams of these wooden ships. The tar coated the ropes and the lines to prevent rot. In fact, British sailors were referred to at the time as tars because their hands were stained black from handling the ship's lines. And turpentine was used for paint and other uses. These products were sent down the river on flatboats to Brunswick Port for export. As you can see from this, they were distilled, and then they were put into wooden barrels, sent down, then loaded on ocean-going ships where they were distributed all over the world. With the upcoming revolution, most of these Scots tended to be loyalists, especially the new arrivals. They took their oath of loyalty very seriously, and they remembered how the Jacobite rebels were treated by the victorious British Army after the Battle of Culloden. To say the least, they were hesitant to challenge the world's greatest army and navy. While these Highlanders were settling northeast or southeastern North Carolina, another group was beginning to populate the Piedmont and the mountain regions of the state. These were the Scots-Irish, or otherwise properly known as Ulster Scots. So I'm sure everybody in this group knows these were lowland Scots that had been sent to the Ulster plantations in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And they were sent there to basically pacify the Catholic Irish that were quite troublesome to the English, and possibly also to get rid of some of the bothersome lowland reivers. As it turns out, these Scots had little interaction with the native Irish, and both the Irish Catholics and Presbyterian Scots were treated pretty badly by the English. These lowland Scots found out that they had no better treatment in Northern Ireland than they had been in the Scottish borders. And to make things worse, with the wars in Europe to be paid for, rents continued to rise until they could hardly make any money. So it became increasingly more difficult to live there, so a mass migration began in earnest about 1710. Philadelphia was the most welcoming port, so that is where they arrived. Land near the city had been taken, so they, as well as many German immigrants, continued west, settling land until they ran into the Appalachian Mountains. At that time, they couldn't cross the mountains, so that they turned south down the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, down through here, and into the Carolinas and what was to later become Tennessee. They brought with them their self-reliance, distrust of authority, music, and whiskey-making talent. Without mountain moonshine, we wouldn't have NASCAR and bluegrass today. We all know that NASCAR was started by moonshiners competing to see who had the fastest car to avoid the revenuers. With their dislike of the English, there's no surprise that most of these Scots-Irish became patriots. As you can see by this map, even up until this time, Western North Carolina has some of the highest percentage of self-identified Scots-Irish in the nation, where the national average is about 1.1% that identify themselves as Scots-Irish. In this area of the state, you're talking about anywhere from 3.5% to 14%. So it's a very large representation. It is somewhat ironic that these Scots Highlanders settled in low coastal plain of North Carolina, while the lowlanders settled in the mountains. Okay, where was I here? Okay. This is, of course, the state of the flag of North Carolina. So leading up into and during the Revolutionary War, these two groups shaped North Carolina's destiny as illustrated by our state flag. These two dates, May the 20th, 1775, and April the 12th, 1776, have special meaning. The first date is the signing of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. This document was carefully crafted and signed by several upstanding citizens of Charlotte. A few were Princeton-educated Presbyterian Scots-Irish. At least one was a Presbyterian minister. And they did not take this act lightly. They knew that by signing this document, they were committing high treason and would surely be hanged if they were captured. Copies of the Declaration were sent to Philadelphia, but never presented to Continental Congress because at that time, it was too early to declare independence. The second date, April 12, 1776, is the signing of the Halifax Resolves. This document gave North Carolina's representatives in Philadelphia authorization to vote for independence. It was the first colony to do so. That is why many of our license plates say First in Freedom. The Halifax Resolves came about as a result of the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge near Wilmington. Fought on February 27, 1776, this was the first battle of the American Revolution where a patriot militia militarily defeated a combined British and Loyalist force. It was also the world's last charge of Scottish Highlanders carrying broadswords, some wearing kilts and speaking Gaelic. Just as the first Patriot victory occurred against Highland Scots at Moores Creek in February of 1776, in 1780, the Battle of Kings Mountain near the North Carolina, South Carolina border took place. This was a pivotal Revolutionary War battle. It was fought between colonial loyalists, many of them Highlanders, and mostly Scots-Irish patriots, many of whom were called the Overmountain Men from the North Carolina and Tennessee mountains. This was a resounding Patriot victory with only one British soldier in attendance. That was Major Ferguson, who was killed. So from Moores Creek to Kings Mountain, from North Carolina's perspective, from 1775 or so, 1781, this was largely the first American Civil War. Highlander loyalists against Scots-Irish patriots, neighbor against neighbor, as Don McLeod so ably described last month. As you can see, North Carolina has a tremendous amount of Scottish influence in its formation, and we feel it's about time to get the word out. That's why the Cape Fear Scottish Immigration Memorial Fund was formed 6 years ago by a group of people who are also members of the Scottish Society of Wilmington. This is our logo, which shows the Cape Fear River over to St. Andrew's Cross. Of course, the dogwood is the state flower, and the immigration ship, and then a nod to the Ulster Scots. Our goal through the Scottish Immigration Project is to establish the Scottish Immigration Trek, commemorating various places and events relating to those early Scots throughout the state. This information is to be available on an interactive website that we hope to widely publicize. Our mission is divided into 3 parts. The first part is the erection of commemorative monuments like the cairn just erected at Brunswick Town. And later on, another will be erected in the western part of the state, possibly near Grandfather Mountain. This is the cairn that we just completed within the last month, actually, dedicated to the Scottish immigrants who began arriving here in 1739. Legacy, enduring spirit, resilience, and contributions of this country helped shape the foundation of North America and North Carolina, of course. Leading up to the memorial, there's 2 storyboards. And basically what this is a who, what, when, why, and where they came from, the major ports in Scotland where the Highlanders left, where they arrived, and an explanation of why. And part of the reason for this is most of the people that visit the state park are unaware of this. We're trying to educate them. This was people were coming to see the Civil War fort or to see the ruins of the colonial town. And most people you'll find are completely unaware of the Scots coming in. So it's our job to educate people. While several projects are running concurrently, our major effort was to erect a substantial memorial to the 20,000 or so Highlanders that arrived at the mouth of the Cape Fear starting in 1739. While raising money for many individuals and Scottish organizations, such as the Dunvegan Foundation, St. Andrew's Society, Clan Campbell, various other Scottish clans and individuals, we were lobbying the state of North Carolina to allow us to build this monument at the Brunswick Town Fort Anderson State Historic Site. Even though this was to cost the state nothing because of politics, naturally, it was a long, hard effort to secure the necessary approvals. These are some of the pavers that we have put in to help recognize those people that have made financial contributions to get this done and to commemorate some of their ancestors. So if any of you have ancestors that arrived through the Carolinas, you may want to consider one of these plaques or your clan organization. Brunswick Town was founded 300 years ago this year. It was a royal port. This is where the Scots first set foot on the Americas after a 6-week or longer sea voyage. These were the only settlers to sail directly to North Carolina in groups from Europe. Other groups landed elsewhere and migrated in. In 1776, the British burned Brunswick Town to the ground. Even though the town itself was never rebuilt, ships continued to arrive here since the river was too shallow for ocean-going ships to continue upriver to Wilmington until 1828 when it was dredged. Unfortunately, many shipping records were lost when the town was burned. However, this is one port record that shows the arrival of the 180-foot ship Cato on December the 1st of 1774. She left Portree on the Isle of Skye under ballast with a cargo, as you can see here, of 312 Highland passengers. It's hard to imagine that many people on a 180-foot long wooden ship for that period of time, possibly 6 to 8 weeks, sailing across the North Atlantic. It had to be a harrowing voyage. As bad as this voyage was, can you imagine a ship landing in June or July, leaving the Highlands in their typical cool weather, rainy and cool, and then landing in 90-degree plus heat, and then walking 100 miles through mosquitoes and tick-infested woods? Not a pleasant thought. If you visit Brunswick Town today, you'll see the foundation of many of the buildings that have been excavated and preserved by an ongoing archaeological project. In fact, last month, the remains of the Spanish privateer La Fortuna was found right off the waterfront. The ship attacked Brunswick Town in 1748 during the King George's War with Spain, and while firing on the town, it exploded and sank. In addition to our monument, you'll also be able to look out over the Cape Fear River and see exactly what these Scots saw in the 1700s. There are no buildings or man-made structures in sight, thanks to the military ammunition terminal next door. A buffer zone in the event of an explosion was created to prevent any development across the river. This memorial cairn will be formally dedicated on November the 15th of this year. You'll notice that the rocks at the base of the cairn, archaeologists have identified these as actual ballast stones that came over on these immigrant ships. As I'm sure you can see, Brunswick Town is the right place to begin our Scottish immigration trek. The second goal of our organization is to identify significant Scottish historical locations throughout the state and to publicly present memorial plaques adding these locations to the immigration trek. One of the first is the South River Presbyterian Church. This was a Gaelic-speaking congregation founded in the mid-1700s. It was founded by Highlanders and a few immigrants from the Orkney Islands. The South River is a tributary of the Black River, which in turn is a tributary of the Cape Fear. This location is typical of these early settlers. With no roads, the settlements sprang up along the river and its various tributaries. The present church building was erected just prior to the Civil War. It is no longer an active church and is owned and maintained by a private trust. This is myself and the chairman of our board and president of Clan Henderson's, Leon Hicks, were making a presentation at their annual gathering. In the center is the president of their trust, Scott Cromarty, whose ancestor came over and landed at Brunswick Town in 1758. As mentioned earlier, the Moores Creek National Battleground was an important part of Scottish history in North Carolina. Being a national park, we were able to convince the U.S. Park Service to erect a wayside sign to tell the story, not only of how the Highlanders fought, but how they would have walked through the park in the decades before the battle on their way to settlements in the backcountry. This is the first sign that has been posted there in this park that has been there for obviously many years, talking about something other than the battle. As it's next to or right on top of the remnants of this old river road. So upon arriving in North Carolina, hundreds, and I would say thousands, of Scottish immigrants traveled this road to establish Scottish American communities in the backcountry. Many of these same Scots marched back on this road to the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. Scottish American history and culture remains an important part of the cultural heritage of North Carolina today. And another important step on our trek is the Mill Prong House in Red Springs, North Carolina. This house was built in 1795 by a Scottish merchant. It is also owned and being preserved by a private trust. There were many Highland Scots in this area, including Flora MacDonald, the famous woman that helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape after the Battle of Culloden. The house was built by John Gilchrist, a Scots merchant originally from Glasgow. We made this presentation during their annual meeting, where descendants of the Native Americans from the area, the enslaved workers that worked the farm, and relatives of the original owner were in attendance. It was very, very moving. We also recently presented a plaque to the Scottish Heritage Center at St. Andrews University in Scotland County. Unfortunately, the university closed shortly thereafter, and collections and artifacts are now in storage awaiting a new home. Scottish Heritage USA has taken on a project to find a new home for this important collection, and hopefully it'll be relocated in an area with more public exposure. Even though there are many more Highland locations to identify in the Sandhills region, as the trek continues westward, we'll be looking for like-minded people to join us and help identify places that were built by the Scots, Irish, and the Piedmonts in the mountains. As we envision it, the trek will continue to Grandfather Mountain at the western end of the state, where another cairn or a similar monument will be put up. With annual attendance of up to 40,000 people and 109 clans represented last year, Grandfather Mountain Highland Games is quite possibly the largest Scottish themed event in the country, if not the world. The third and the most important element of our project is to get the word out. We plan to do this in large part by creating an interactive website. We are currently working with students in a graduate program at Coastal Carolina University to develop this website. A large part of the site will be an interactive map with pins placed on all the identified important locations. By clicking on any pin, you'll be taken to photos, recorded narrations, and documents relating to the site. We would also have a section on the website about certain individuals, as well as submitted family stories. By widely publicizing this website, we hope to influence teachers, local chambers of commerce, and others to raise awareness of our very important Scottish heritage. As you have seen, this is an ongoing project. We continue to raise funds and encourage volunteers to help us spread the word. Thank you. If there's any questions, I'm glad to take them. Oh, by the way, this is our website. It's under development now, but it has information on it as to how you can purchase one of the pavers if you would so desire. But keep coming back because we are continuing to work on it. Okay.
Sorry for that disturbance, Bob. Bob, that was absolutely amazing. And your pictures and maps and illustrations were just terribly enlightening. I can't thank you enough. It was excellent. I'm sure everyone agrees. Let's open the floor and have a little dialogue with Bob. Please, everyone, unmute your mics and undim your cameras. Tom, are you going to start the discussion?
I
nothing like being put on the spot. Yes.
It's Margaret. I had a great interest in this because for many years I lived in Wilmington and
Oh,
only recently sold my parents' house down there about 4 years ago. A lot of this information was new to me. I had been to Moores Creek, which is what caught my attention for the presentation. But this was fascinating information. Even though I lived there, I did not realize the history behind those Moores Creek people being there. I did know it was Scots against Scots, but this was amazing. I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
well, Margaret, it's interesting that you would say that, because even though Moores Creek is 20 miles from where I am right now, and Brunswick Town down the river is probably 35 miles, and I grew up here in Wilmington, you'd be surprised how many natives have never been to these places. This really hasn't been publicized. And this is the reason that we're trying to do this, to educate people. In high school, I had to take North Carolina history, and I learned a lot about the Civil War and a few other things, and some about the early settlement, but nothing about the contribution these Scots made to the state. So we're trying to get the word out.
That's excellent.
Hey, Bob, this is Bill.
Well, hey, Bill.
You remember we talked about the sword that was in the Dunvegan Castle and Isle of Skye? If the sword from Colonel McLeod that led that charge at Moores Creek?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Bill. That was an interesting story. And as normal with some of these stories, there is the story and then there's the truth. What Bill's referring to is in the Dunvegan Castle on the Isle of Skye, there is a series of display cases, and one of them has an officer's sword and I believe a dagger and a few other things, and said these were carried by Colonel McLeod at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. Well, the story is that when the loyalists were crossing the bridge, of course, the officers was leading the charge. The two officers were Campbell and McLeod. It was basically an ambush. The bridge, they had removed the planks across the bridge, just leaving the stringers, and had greased them. And so these loyalists were coming across kind of single file. The Patriots waited until a number of them crossed the bridge, and they opened fire with muskets and 2 cannons. Well, as it turns out, Colonel McLeod ended up with 27 bullet holes in him. And so at the time, if you killed an officer of the opposing army, you got his sword as a war prize. Well, with 27 holes in him, it's kind of hard to tell who get the prize. So the story is they had a foot race, and who won the foot race got the sword. So that was the story. So then I got in touch with the people at Dunvegan Castle, and I guess his title was the conservator of the castle, backpedaled a little bit. So, well, maybe that sword wasn't the sword that the colonel held, but it was a sword that was there. So that's how that all worked out.
I am tracing the Drummonds from Perth into the US. I can find them in Pennsylvania. I can find them in what is now West Virginia and in Virginia prior to that. I don't have a date. And they married into the Nickel family sometime around 1800.
Mm-hmm. Well, what we found in our limited research is what has happened is they settled the sandhills. Well, of course, they had families, and then the families had their own farms. And as the population grew, migration continued. So a lot of these early immigrants, their families ended up populating not only North and South Carolina, but tended to go south. We have quite a few that ended up down in Louisiana, Alabama, Texas even. Don't see a whole lot of them that went north, but I'm certainly that they did. But most of the Scots that you find in the southeast, there were small groups that went into Savannah, but by far the largest group came into the Cape Fear River.
That's my husband's side, the Drummond side. My side is the Ruddle side, and I have not traced him back to England. Could very well be Scotch-Irish. So that part was very interesting to me. They settled in Western Pennsylvania and were part of the migration into the Shenandoah Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And then went west on the Oregon Trail. So,
Well, if you go down the Shenandoah Valley, you'll find both Scots, Irish, and Germans. Quite a few of them.
I am a descendant of Joist Height, the German in that area in the Shenandoah Valley.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Anybody else?
Mr. McLeod, it was a great presentation. You really educated me on a lot of things and increased my knowledge. I'm actually from Kinston. I'm from North Carolina, and I live here in Chicago. So we have something in common there.
There you go.
And I have an ancestor by the name of William Jacob Manus II, who immigrated around the late 1730s, early 1740s.
Mm-hmm.
So this really helps me to understand. He actually went through Philadelphia and went down the Great Trail to Moores Creek. In fact, I found that out about 10 years ago, and I did some genealogical research. And there's a website called the Wallaces of Moore County that somebody has taken great pains to document all the families of Moore County. And quite a few of them are of Scottish heritage. Mm-hmm. So that was a very good resource. But you've also increased my knowledge too on Brunswick Town, which I wasn't familiar with, because I'm more familiar with Beaufort and Bath and the counties a little bit further north of the state.
Well, you mentioned Moore County, and of course that was in the middle of the Sandhills. A lot of Scots there. In Scotland County, Laurinburg is one of the larger towns, I guess, and it is so Scottish that I understand why they're still publishing the white pages that everybody got on their doorstep, where most white pages throughout the country were divided into 26 sections for A through Z. Well, Laurinburg had 27, because after the M's, they had a whole other section that was MC. So there's so many of them. There's a town there called Maxton, which is a contraction of Max Town. So many Max. So it's just there, even today, just a tremendous amount of Scots and descendants in that area.
Wow.
Bob, did you mention your grand opening to everyone?
That will be on the 15th of November. And if anybody is in the area or can come, we would love to have you. This will be a formal dedication. Like I said, originally, we've been working on this thing for 6 years, and it's finally coming to fruition. And I think we have built a really fitting monument to these Scots. And we would certainly like to have as many people as possible share with us this dedication ceremony. So I don't know that the governor will be here, but he's been invited. So we'll see what happens. But November the 15th, put it on your calendar. North Carolina, the weather is usually very nice that time of the year. So it should be good. Thanks, Connie.
Bob?
Yes, Don?
Yes, you mentioned a lot of the Highlanders from North Carolina went south. There were quite a few that went north.
No.
At the end of the Revolution,
oh, right.
There were many Scottish Highlanders from North Carolina who wound up in Canada.
Yeah.
Many of them received land grants from the king. There are even loyalist societies in some of the eastern Canadian cities and towns. There were 100,000 Americans left the U.S. that were loyalists. 100,000. Some went to Florida, some went to Canada, Scotland, England, the West Indies. So that was quite a migration out. Thank you.
So Don, when did Flora McDonald leave? She left prior to the Revolutionary War, didn't she?
No, her husband, Alan, was captured at Moores Creek. Her son-in-law, Alexander McLeod, who had married Anne, Flora's daughter, he escaped, made his way to New York and joined the British Army. Alan was a prisoner, later released. She had 2 miserable years in North Carolina. She arrived about 1774 and was there about 2 years.
You know, I'll just add a note to that, Don, if I may. After all the loyalists to the crown were exiled by the new United States of America, and as Don said, many went to Canada, Nova Scotia, and other places. Roughly 40 or 50 years later, because the lifestyle was so brutal and difficult in those unpioneered areas to the north, many of the exiled Scots and others began applying for asylum in America and wanting to come back. And the Americans forgave them and welcomed them with open arms. And so many people cross-migrated back down to the States again, which is interesting.
I'll say without absolutely rhetorically that some of the issues that were dealt with politically several hundred years ago seem to still plague us in ways today. We review this as a history lesson, but it's good to think about what in this history could teach us as we confront our issues today of differences of opinion, migration, violence, all of this. It's not a lot different, at least as far as I can tell, from some of the things we still face now. And I'm not trying to explode a political discussion this morning. I'm only saying, in light of all the things that we see and hear in the news today, these events of several hundred years ago seem to still ring some sense of contemporary to me as well.
I've been cleaning my garage but and listening, so I haven't been on speaker or video just yet. But I wanted to say shortly, my last name, Scraughan, is a derivative of Strawn from the village of Strawn, south of Aberdeen. So was there last summer, had a wonderful time. But the Strawns were broken up by Robert the Bruce, and half of them went to England, and that's where the name change to Strawn, Aughan, occurred. But the Strawn name, Scrachan, was ridiculed because they were related to the Common family, which was against Robert the Bruce. So they were embarrassed and they started calling themselves Strachan instead of Strawn. But the clan chief, who has been a clan chief for about 3 years now, after a 10-year wait, says it is called Strawn. But they eventually came over. The Strawn Chans and Aughans came over in the 1600s and 1700s and came through North Carolina. Many of them were slave owners, which is, to be honest, a very regrettable time in American history. But tracking it and being factual, they did. My father's maternal side is Irish, and we're family members way back in the Revolutionary War through the Potts family, Cotts. But I have enjoyed this extra level of details. Thank you for that, adding to the story. adding to the history and pride that I have in being Scots and being Sean. Thank you.
Good. Okay.
Bob, perhaps you could discuss some of the sites in North Carolina. It's really full of Scottish memorial sites and war sites and so forth. The homestead of Flora and Alan McDonald, and there are just all kinds of things to see down there. Some of you, Don McLeod, are docents, but maybe some of you North Carolinians can share with others all the wonderful tourism in North Carolina.
Yes, we would certainly welcome any suggestions. We're always looking for sites to commemorate, to add to our trek. And as I mentioned, we started here in the Lower Cape Fear. We're moving out, and now we want to start finding some of the Scots-Irish sites to commemorate as well, because they were so important, and they're just as Scottish as the Highlanders. It's just that they ended up spending a generation or two in Ireland without a lot of mixing with the Irish population. So we consider them all Scots. And that's why I say, I think arguably that North Carolina is the most Scottish state in the Union.
I agree with you. My other branch of my family were Quakers in North Carolina.
Mm.
And the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought on my ancestors' land.
Wow, interesting.
But they were Quakers and came in through the very northern tip of North Carolina about 1700.
Uh-huh.
The name is Jessup.
Okay.
So it's a fascinating place to visit.
Oh, yeah.
Don, you probably have some comments you could make about the Quakers and the fact that they didn't believe in war and they were supportive of the Scots who were fighting in the American Revolution, but weren't fighting themselves.
Well, it's interesting. North Carolina, the only people who came straight from Europe were the Highland Scots. The English settlers on the eastern side of North Carolina had moved it down from Virginia. The rest of the population, except for the enslaved black population, largely came from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, down the Great Wagon Road. That included the Quakers. There were a lot of Quakers, several thousand Quakers in the Greensboro, High Point area. And they were pacifists, hardly any of them participated in the wars. Maybe a few did. I know one he owned a Lindley who owned a mill in the Revolution. He had two sons. One was a patriot, one was a loyalist, and one of them was killed. Even though they were Quakers, they participated on opposite sides during the Revolution. So it was a mixed thing. And the Scots-Irish tended to be patriots, very strong patriots, but many of them were loyalists. It was not a clear-cut scene. You could raise a patriot militia and a loyalist militia out of the same Highland Scot, not Highland Scot, but Ulster Scot population. Very mixed bag. And Bob, as far as the immigration trek, there's some very interesting Scots-Irish churches in the Piedmont. Churches that were formed about 1750 and have remarkable cemeteries with revolutionary patriots and so forth. Matter of fact, the Presbyterian Society, Historical Society, we have a meeting coming up in a month at Hopewell Presbyterian Church near Charlotte, 1750. Some generals, very important revolutionary figures are buried there. That would be a
I'd
great.
love to get information on that.
That would be a great. That would be a great spot on the immigration.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I'd like to get some information from you about that. Sounds like a great place.
Other questions, comments? for Bob or anyone else?
No?
Well, Bob, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's been a real distinct pleasure to have you discuss this today, and can't thank you enough.
Well,
And
thank
we'll
you.
hope some of us to get down there and experience the opening with you.
Well, please, thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to help get the word out about how important the Scots are in North Carolina and the country. And we just need to help continue educating people about this. So thank you for this opportunity.
You're very welcome. Anyone who wants to stay on and chat, you're welcome. Otherwise, we're going to shut her down, probably, the official part.
Okay.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
Bob.
everyone. Thanks
Goodbye.
for coming.
Thank you.